This is from the website thewaythetruthandthelife.net.
The purpose of this video is to explain that illiterate cultures of the past were not necessarily ignorant. In fact, some were much more intellectual than written cultures because the communication was word of mouth and storytelling. It didn't mean they were ignorant. It didn't mean that they were stuck reading books. It meant they were interacting with other human beings. And there's much evidence to support this, particularly with the Roma that kept their culture for in the order of 1,400 years. They escaped starting around 900 years after Christ. They escaped the Islamic invasions of India and came to the Christian farm areas of the Byzantine Empire and around the Black Sea, and found safety as they drifted in their wagons and took what they needed from the ground and worked with their skills, sold their skills to the farms around which they traveled. And they found safety in that Christian environment. There was an environment of home churches where the knowledge of Christ and the home meetings were storytelling also for the first couple hundred years around the Black Sea. The Goths came down from Scandinavia and settled in that area and became Christianized before they were literate. And it was the Goths then, after invading Rome, made a Gothic alphabet in order to publish the Bible. That home church, family church, they called them the Arian heresy because they had, in part of their storytelling was where Jesus said, I go to the Father and he is greater than I. So they respected that. And that conflicted with the worldly Catholic Church dogma, and they were even burned at the stake for their heresy of believing that the Father was greater than the Son. That the storytelling culture of home family Christianity went on into the Alps and on over to Spain, and with the Goths split into a couple of different groups, and the affluence of the warlord Goths after Visigoths, they ended up accepting the Roman dogma in order to get the recognition of their affluent lordly status. But the home church process went on in the Alp villages and kept on, and was actually the foundation for what later would be called Amish, but it was something that never died out. The point of this video is about how valuable a storytelling culture is, where the family, with the Roma, it was that they would get together at night with their wagons and sit around the fire telling the stories. But the insight came to me from Bruno Bettelheim when his retirement colloquy at the University of Buffalo. I had the good fortune to be in the audience, and when he finished, I asked him, "Are you a religious Jew?" And he said, no. Now, mind you, Bruno was a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust and had written about survivors, very interesting insights, had written about children raised in kibbutzim, had studied folk tales. His main focus was his school for autistic children funded by the Ford Foundation at Chicago University. But that's a whole nother story. And I asked him, are you a religious Jew? And he said, no, I'm not a religious Jew, but I have great respect for the Jewish Bible because these stories exist in the storytelling cultures around that area. They were highly developed cultures. The point that Bruno made here was that the elders were the storytellers, and the nonsense stories got dropped. They kept the stories that would be of value in the development of their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So the nonsense was lost. It's not like today with the goofy videos and goofy books that are there because they attract children in goofiness rather than caring for their potential for development. So it was the selectivity of the elders that gave these cultures, these storytelling cultures, such a high quality. It was out of their caring for their future progeny. They didn't have a written language. It was face-to-face. Now, like with the Roma, also there was the child care was very strong with the Roma, even though they were not a farm family. Within the Roma camps, the women didn't wear anything above the waist because they're typically breastfed till the child was 4 or 5 years old. And the same with the farm families. The breastfeeding went on, and the fellowship of the family and the family meeting to pass on the stories of Jesus with family church just went on. It has never died, but the affluence of the cities is destroying it. The worldly church religion was either used for male dominance or for female manipulation. The Islamic faith is used for male domination, and worldly Christian churches were used by women to have the manipulative power over their husbands. Now, in Europe and more in America, the churches are empty because the women don't need to manipulate the priest. They have the civil law on their side. In Kenmore, New York, where I come from, you holler at your wife, she can have you arrested. But yet she can be screaming at an infant before it can walk or talk because it's crying. They don't need a priest, and as a matter of fact, in Europe, most of the first children, in many cases, are born without a father. The husband is not a very high priority. They don't need it now with subsidized daycare, and of course, the autism is a terrible tragedy to deprive children of the mammalian level nursing bond. Just quickly there, how important that is, that the brain scan shows the child has a calming effect from the mother's voice, and any other woman, and this is right from birth, any other woman causes some level of stress comparatively. And the autism, it's very clear, it's a lack of the mammalian ability of the mother to bond to the child, whether she has been raised in daycare and doesn't have it, or she has it but she's out working and the child is left with babysitters. This destruction of human child rearing, I call it anthropoculture, the raising of human beings, has been so degraded. And what we don't understand is affluence degraded it. this reading books is a poor substitute for human interaction. Let me add two insights from Russia. The first was when I was getting my master's degree in education. That was while Soviet communism was still in effect. And I did a research paper on education in the Soviet Union. And what I found was literature showed a high regard for children. The next generation of the communist socialism is like a religion. The Russians were sacrificing to bring roads and schools and hospitals to the rest of the world. But they paid high salaries to the teachers. The education was a place of honor and respect. What they didn't understand was the child needed a home and a mother in the home. Germany will be going downhill, but they had the German children. Obama 2 years ago says we got to start early daycare because the Germans are graduating their children and they're a year ahead of our children when they get out of school. And what he didn't understand in his ignorance was that the German children, the mothers, until last year or the year before, Merkel did away with the lack of child care for married women. They were to stay in the home, and they did. And until the children were 6 or 7 to go to school, the children started school later than the American children and ended up with scoring at least a year above them, not because they had early education, it's because they had a foundation, a mammalian maternal bond and homemaking foundation, and that's been robbed. But you will find, the quality control that the German manufacturing could depended on people that they could depend on. And they had this core foundation of people with ethics and responsibility because they had a human foundation from the mother in the home. And now Merkel's done away with that along with all the women's liberationists. So Germany's great reputation for quality control will be down with the rest of Spain and Italy before too long. But that's another thing. And coming back to Russia, they didn't understand how important the mother in the home was. They took the mother out of the home and put the children in group care, and it is the degradation is so real. It's heart sickening. I mean, I have Russian residents. I've lived here. I'm in Russia right now, and I've lived here for 6 months a year for the last 14 years, and taught English. They let me use the English-Russian Bible because the students could read the verses. This was in the public library. The children could read the verses in Russian and know what they meant. I can't. I'm too old to learn Russian, but my purpose, just like when I taught in Belarus and in Lithuania, where they need a native speaker. Their teachers in the schools can teach them how to read English, but they can't teach them how to speak it correctly. So at any rate, but the degradation of child care is really, and the problem is, even if a mother wants to be a good mother, she doesn't have the animal level ability. That comes from the care before she could walk or talk. And if she didn't get it, she doesn't have it. And it gets degraded generationally. Look at the exponential increase of autism, and that's where it comes from. The other thing I wanted to say about the home church is, yes, communism, they pretty much degraded them, although they started coming up again, the Baptists and the Pentecostals. But the old home church, my wife, Olga, came from that background, and her grandfather in Armenia. Her home church background people were being killed by the Tsar and the Orthodox Church for being, they were charged because they wouldn't follow the fasting days and wouldn't worship the icons and this kind of thing. They were labeled as felons and put in jail. Many died in jail. I think one of the estimates is close to 1 million. These were called spiritual Christians. Once they got the Bible and read about it, they started home churches, and that was in 1600s. In the 1700s, our people escaped Russia and went to Persia. Then, in the 1800s, when Russia had rescued part of Armenia, where the Turkish had exterminated the Armenians, the Russians come in and rescued Armenia for them, but it was depopulated, and these home Christians living in Persia, which is Iran today, petitioned the Lord if they could come, and they were allowed to immigrate to Armenia. That's how my wife's people ended up in Armenia in the 1800s, and they were all given 1,500 acres, or hectares. But Olga's grandfather was a highly respected, this spiritual Christians, and her group was called Malakani, meant milk drinkers. You can still, they're spread around the world today. You can look on Wikipedia, I think, and find them. But her great-grandfather was highly respected among the home churches as an elder to go to with problems, to get advice. That he had carried his Bible, and the communism came, and he was arrested. Now, there were many Christians were killed for not giving up their practices, but he was put in jail, but then they released him. And the Malakani home churches in Armenia went on while Olga was, she lived with someone. She went to school there in, I can't remember the name of the capital of Armenia right now, but at any rate, that's some of the background of insights from these things on family, love as a foundation, not memorization, but family meetings, and the value of intergenerational communication. And the description of a book is a description of a thing. I taught physics by experiment. What a difference to have students that actually are learning from doing rather than reading a book and memorizing something to pass a test. And we call that, I don't know, in modern society, but it's a terrible deprivation of the human interaction necessary for healthy growth. The point here is the storytelling cultures were not necessarily inferior at all. In fact, many times and in many cases were superior because the elders were respected. You find the same thing in the farm family areas of China, and you find the respect for the elders and all of these things. Of course, it's going away with urbanization, just like the healthy Roma or gypsy culture is dead. They're moved to the city and affluence, and they're being civilized, incorporated into the daycare and public school and memorizing text rather than learning from human interaction of a more meaningful nature. Let me go back to Russia here before I end this, because two very important things. In the early 90s, all of a sudden, we had a whole bunch of Russian students in our suburban Buffalo home. It turns out there was a whole church of Russians, a Baptist church. And it turned out that was, in America, around 1,500,000 Russians showed up all of a sudden and were helped. My students, very good students, had some work for me helping grading papers. Their parents were being subsidized to go to the university. A lot of help was given them. It was to help get the Jews released from Russia that they could immigrate to Israel. Soviet Union had broken up, that they didn't want the Jews to immigrate because of all the money invested in their education and the positions they had in administration. And so the Israeli government went to the American government to help them get the Jews released from Russia, who was trying to keep them there and didn't want them to take their wealth too. But the deal was, you take our home church people, these Baptists and Pentecostals, and we'll let the Jews go to Israel. And that's what happened. Now it's completely different. President Putin is trying to get the Russian Amish to come back from South America to be involved in farming and populating Russia. Russia's going down. Many years they've had more abortions than live births. That the home church is respected here now. Let me add another thing about that before I end. Going to our home church conventions in Moscow, here we find these men from our home church that were lawyers for some company here in Russia, for executives for that company, and back in the States, one friend from Rochester, a vice president of Shell Oil, another from my home meeting in a suburban Buffalo home church. Now he was worldwide representative for Moog Valve, and now he's managing some Japanese auto plant that they built in America. The point is, it's so hard to find good people that you can trust on the road that aren't involved in drugs and sex and drinking and corruption. Our simple home church, and there's not that many, and it's getting corrupted into a priesthood, but the men who are brought up with this culture of family love and respect and honor and respect for family, and have had that loving foundation. It's not a joke. They're not heterosexual because they're forced to. They had a foundation to grow to that level of ability to love the opposite sex, and to not be out looking for promiscuous relationships and alcohol entertainment and that. So many, and it's so hard for companies to find good people today. You can find, that's a whole nother subject. I was thinking about the women that Obama has put into office and some of the things I've had to witness, like when that shoe bomber and gone away to Detroit and his bomb didn't go off, and she says the system worked. She's in charge of Homeland Security. But that's a whole other thing. There are differences between men and women. Man's right and left brain have separated functions. Women tend to be duplicates because their survival historically was to take care of the day and the children. The man's survival historically was the logic to understand where the warfare or hunting came from the past and how to do the future. And it's totally different. There's billions of more brain cells for this logical process. Men's right and left hemispheres specialize, one the verbal, logical, and the other the pattern intellect. And not so with the women. A clear example of this is when women have a stroke, the other hemisphere, they can still usually walk or talk. Maybe not as good, but the other hemisphere can replace the damaged area. Men are more frequently disabled because one side of the brain has the stroke and the brain damage, and that function isn't duplicated in the other hemisphere. But it's a specialization. And to have it not respected, just like when I worked at Carborundum Research, a man could support a family, and then they come in with this affirmative action, that hiring people that were incompetent because they were minority or women, and they had to lower the wages until they couldn't afford. A man can't afford to keep a mother in the home to care for the children today. That's just another side point. At any rate, I'll go on now. So that's the basic idea here. The storytelling cultures were not ignorant, and the Roma are a prime example. Over 1,000 years, a culture persisted without a written language. And also the farm family culture, whether in China or in around the Black Sea, the Christian home culture. Another point of before I end this, that Bruno had brought up, that the flood was in a number of culture story, old cultures, the story of the flood, and what that amounts to is, in fact, Gibraltar was a dam, just like the Caspian Sea is below sea level. The Mediterranean was below sea level, and when the dam broke of Gibraltar and the Atlantic Ocean flooded across and up over the mountains, that's the origin of the flood that was carried on for thousands of years in the storytelling cultures. That's the point here. Thank you.